1. The Battle of the Pyramids, 1798. Let's start with the time Napoleon Bonaparte decided to bring the gifts of civilization to the Middle East. The 1798 French expedition to Egypt is usually remembered as this grand, romantic scientific adventure. And to be fair, Napoleon's packing list was wild. Alongside his artillery, he brought the Commission des Sciences et des Arts, a fully staffed entourage of 167 savants. He brought botanists, civil engineers, astronomers, and even a guy whose specific job was just to study balloons. It was the ultimate Enlightenment flex, invading a sovereign territory, but making sure you brought enough guys in powdered wigs to accurately measure a crocodile. He also brought the first modern PR machine. Napoleon hauled Arabic printing presses across the Mediterranean just so he could print leaflets claiming he was actually a devout friend of Islam, sent to liberate the local Egyptians from their oppressive Mamluk rulers. It's an incredibly modern geopolitical strategy. Tell them you're just there for regime change, then set up your surveying equipment. But before the science fair could officially begin, there was the Battle of the Pyramids on July 21st. Napoleon rode out in front of his troops and delivered that legendary line, "Soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." It's a fantastic quote. It looks incredible inscribed on a bronze plaque. The reality of the battle, though, it was less of a legendary clash of empires and more of a time machine malfunction. You had Murad Bey leading the Mamluk cavalry, a visually stunning, fiercely brave aristocratic warrior class, who were essentially still fighting like it was the 14th century. They charged across the sand in silk robes on thoroughbred horses, wielding jeweled scimitars and an absolute surplus of good vibes. Waiting for them were 20,000 French infantrymen formed into massive divisional squares. Cannons at the corners, ranks of bayonets, disciplined volley fire. The French essentially brought an industrial meat grinder into the desert. The Mamluks charged the squares repeatedly, just shattering themselves against modern European military geometry. The casualty disparity is genuinely hard to process. The French lost fewer than 30 men. The Mamluks lost thousands, with hundreds more drowning in the Nile because it turns out it's really hard to swim in heavy medieval armor. And how did this grand civilizing mission end? Within weeks, the British Navy blew up the French fleet, trapping Napoleon in Egypt. By 1799, his army was bogged down in Syria, dying of the bubonic plague. So the great enlightened commander did the only logical thing. He quietly hopped on a frigate in the middle of the night, completely ghosted his entire stranded army, and sailed back to Paris to overthrow the French government. His successor, General Kléber, was left holding the bag and was eventually assassinated, while the British swooped in and confiscated all the best artifacts, including the Rosetta Stone. But hey, the branding was immaculate. 2 centuries later, we still mostly remember the nice drawings of the Sphinx. Point 2. The Battle of Lodi, 1796. If you want to understand the exact historical moment when a military commander transitions from a guy leading an army into a fully realized lifestyle brand, look no further than the Battle of Lodi in 1796. This was early in Napoleon's career during the First Italian campaign. At this point, Bonaparte is just a 26-year-old artillery officer who got the job mostly through political connections in Paris. His troops in the army of Italy are starving, underpaid, and deeply skeptical of this weirdly intense Corsican kid. He doesn't just need a military victory, he needs a headline. He needs to go viral in an era where going viral meant waiting 3 weeks for a courier to reach Paris on horseback. The setup is classic. The main Austrian army under General Bewley is retreating. To cover their escape, they leave a rearguard defense of about 10,000 men and roughly 14 cannons on the opposite side of the Adda River. And between the French and those cannons is a single, narrow, 200-yard-long wooden bridge. Now, basic 18th century military logic dictates that charging a 200-yard wooden choke point directly into the mouth of concentrated artillery is an incredibly stupid idea. And Napoleon knew this. In fact, he had already dispatched his cavalry commander, General Beaumont, to cross at a perfectly safe, lightly defended ford further upstream. All Napoleon had to do was wait for his cavalry to cross, flank the Austrians, and force them to abandon the bridge. It would have been a textbook, low-casualty tactical maneuver. But here is the thing about textbook, low-casualty tactical maneuvers, they make for terrible copy. Sneaking around the back doesn't get you a marble statue in the Louvre. So, rather than wait for the flanking force to do its job, Napoleon ordered a massive frontal assault. He sent his elite grenadiers sprinting across this narrow, wooden plank way. The Austrians opened fire with grape shot, which is essentially turning a cannon into a giant shotgun. It was an absolute meat grinder. Entire ranks of French soldiers were swept off the bridge into the river. The attack stalled out in the center under the sheer volume of lead, and high-ranking officers like Lanners and Berthier had to personally rush to the front, stepping over the bodies of their own men, just to pull the survivors forward. They eventually made it across and forced the Austrians out, but at the cost of hundreds of French casualties. And for what? The main Austrian army was already gone. Strategically, Lodi was essentially meaningless. But politically, it was a masterpiece. This was the battle when Napoleon reportedly got down into the mud and aimed the cannons himself, doing the dirty work of an enlisted man. It was the moment his surviving troops affectionately dubbed him Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. It's the 18th century equivalent of a billionaire CEO doing a highly photographed shift in an Amazon warehouse to prove he's in the trenches with the boys. He manufactured a dramatic high-casualty spectacle when a boring flanking maneuver would have done the exact same job. The blood spilled on that bridge wasn't the strategic cost of taking territory, it was the marketing budget for an aspiring emperor. And honestly, as a PR investment, it worked flawlessly. 3. The Battle of Marengo, 1800. The Battle of Marengo is the ultimate historical example of why you should never hit send on your status report until the workday is actually over. It's 1800. Napoleon has just executed a military coup and declared himself first consul of France. But dictatorial power is surprisingly fragile in its early stages, so he desperately needs a spectacular military victory to justify to the French public why he's suddenly in charge of the Republic. To get this victory, he drags an army across the Alps via the Great St. Bernard Pass. You've probably seen the famous Jacques-Louis David painting, Napoleon pointing heroically toward the summit, his cape blowing in the wind, riding a magnificent, rearing Arabian stallion. The historical reality is that he crossed the pass a few days after his army, riding a very sensible, carefully stepping mule being led by a local peasant. But man on a borrowed mule doesn't exactly scream, "Emperor in waiting." So he gets down into Italy, and he completely misreads the room. He assumes the Austrian army, commanded by a 71-year-old general named Michael von Melas, is retreating. Confident in this assumption, Napoleon splits his forces, sending General Louis Desert miles away to cut off their escape route. Except Melas isn't retreating. He launches a massive, concentrated surprise attack at Marengo. The French are outnumbered, outgunned, and caught completely off guard. By early afternoon, the French lines buckle and break. It is a full-blown, chaotic retreat. General Melas is so absolutely certain that he has crushed the great Napoleon Bonaparte that he actually leaves the battlefield. He hands command over to a subordinate, rides back to his headquarters in Alessandria, takes off his boots, and sends a courier galloping toward Vienna with the official dispatch, announcing a glorious Austrian victory. Meanwhile, miles away, General Desset realizes the Austrian escape route he's supposed to be blocking is completely empty. Then he hears the low, distant rumble of artillery behind him. Without waiting for orders, he turns his entire division around and marches strictly toward the sound of the guns. He rolls up to the battlefield around 5 p.m., finds Napoleon standing in the middle of a collapsing army, looks at the carnage, and supposedly delivers the coldest line of the century. This battle is completely lost, but it is only 5 o'clock. There is time to win another. Desset immediately launches a fresh infantry counterattack, perfectly timed with a devastating heavy cavalry charge led by General François-Étienne de Kellermann. They absolutely shatter the Austrian pursuit. The momentum flips instantly, the victory is secured, the campaign is saved, and the first consul's political career is rescued from the brink of total humiliation. Unfortunately for Desset, he caught a musket ball to the chest at the height of the charge and died in the mud. And frankly, this was incredibly convenient for Napoleon, because dead men can't host press conferences. Bonaparte immediately went to work rewriting the official dispatches. Over the next few years, he published multiple revised accounts of the battle, each time heavily doctoring the maps and the timelines. He framed his morning blunder as a brilliant, deliberate tactical feint. He erased Kellermann's spontaneous cavalry charge, minimized Desailles' autonomy, and painted himself as the omniscient chess master who had perfectly scheduled the entire sequence of events. When reality doesn't match the PR strategy, you just change the reality. 4-4, the Battle of Ulm, 1805. When we think of great military victories, we usually picture crashing cavalry, thundering cannons, and heroic last stands on smoke-filled battlefields. We think of those massive oil paintings in the Louvre, where everyone's uniform is perfectly crisp and the generals are striking heroic poses on horseback. The Battle of Ulm in 1805 had almost none of that, which makes it perhaps the most honest representation of what the Napoleonic Wars actually were. In the late summer of 1805, Napoleon had roughly 200,000 men camped at Boulogne on the English Channel, just staring at the water, waiting to invade Britain. But when a new coalition formed against him in Central Europe, he executed one of the most absurd logistical pivots in military history. He ordered the entire Grande Armée to turn their backs on the ocean and march toward the Danube River. Waiting for them in Bavaria was the Austrian commander, General Karl Freiherr Mack von Leiberich. Mack was an old-school, aristocratic military man. He viewed warfare as a gentlemanly chess match with strict, predictable rules. Armies were supposed to march slowly, stop for the winter, and politely line up in front of each other on an open field. So, Mack took up a heavily fortified position at the city of Ulm and simply waited for the French army to show up in front of him so they could have a proper, civilized battle. But Napoleon didn't play by 18th century gentlemanly rules. Instead of marching directly to meet Mack, he broke his army into separate, self-sustaining corps that moved on parallel roads, sweeping across Europe like a massive net. And the engine of this maneuver wasn't just tactical genius. It was the brutal, physical exploitation of tens of thousands of French conscripts. Napoleon simply ordered his men to walk faster than anyone thought humanly possible. This wasn't a parade. This was a grueling, miserable death march. The troops covered up to 30 miles a day through freezing autumn rain, sleet, and knee-deep mud. Because they were moving so fast, the French supply lines completely collapsed. The men survived by ruthlessly pillaging the German countryside, stealing livestock, emptying local barns, and dismantling fences for firewood. It was effectively a rolling humanitarian disaster masquerading as a brilliant military maneuver. By the time General Mack realized what was happening, the French had marched completely around his right flank, severed his communication lines back to Vienna, and slammed the door shut behind him. He was completely surrounded before he even understood the campaign had started. On October 20th, Mack rode out of the city and surrendered his entire trapped army of roughly 27,000 men. Tactically, it is considered a masterpiece, but it also strips away the romantic veneer of 19th century warfare. The troops themselves knew exactly what had happened. A famous quip circulated among the muddy, starving French infantry. Afterward, the emperor has discovered a new way of making war. He makes it with our legs instead of our bayonets. The great victory at Ulm wasn't won by chivalry or courage. It was won by systematically destroying the knees, backs, and spirits of the working class, literally walking an empire into submission. 5. The Battle of Austerlitz, 1805. Austerlitz is universally considered Napoleon's absolute masterpiece. It's remembered historically as the Battle of the Three Emperors, taking place on December Delius II on 1805, which, not coincidentally, was exactly the one-year anniversary of Napoleon taking a crown from the Pope and placing it on his own head. The stage was set in Moravia, pitting the newly minted French emperor against Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Emperor Francis II of Austria. Tactically, it is a flawless execution of battlefield psychology. Napoleon looked at the map, found the most dominant defensive position on the field, the Pratzen Heights, and deliberately abandoned it. He then intentionally thinned out his own right flank to make it look like a juicy, disorganized, irresistible target. He was essentially playing a massive, high-stakes game of poker with Tsar Alexander's ego. Alexander was a 28-year-old autocrat surrounded by aristocratic yes-men who spent their evenings telling him he was the second coming of Alexander the Great. When he saw that artificially weak French flank, he couldn't resist taking the bait. The Austro-Russian forces gleefully poured off the high ground to crush the right side. What they didn't know was that Marshal Davout's 3 Corps had just force-marched almost 70 miles from Vienna in 48 hours to secretly reinforce that exact spot. Davout's exhausted men absorbed the massive blow, anchoring the line in the freezing Moravian mud. And the moment the Russian center emptied out to join the attack, Napoleon unleashed Marshal Soult's hidden divisions straight up the hill, slicing the enemy army completely in half. The trap slammed shut. The ensuing slaughter was staggering. As the Austro-Russian army collapsed and frantically tried to retreat across the frozen Sachin ponds, French artillery began firing solid iron balls directly into the ice. Thousands of men and horses plunged into the freezing water. It's the kind of cinematic destruction that military historians write entire trilogies about. But let's zoom out for a second and look at the actual geopolitics of what just happened. Why, exactly, was this battle being fought? Just a decade prior, the French army was a revolutionary force of citizens fighting a desperate war of survival against the hereditary monarchies of Europe. They literally fought to dismantle the divine right of kings. Now, in 1805, the guy in charge has not only crowned himself, he's created a brand new aristocracy, complete with dukes and princes, and is busy handing out entire European countries to his brothers. He took the great revolutionary war machine and repurposed it to fight 2 other crowned heads, just to determine whose empire gets to dictate the terms of global trade and resource extraction. The tactical brilliance of Austerlitz is blinding. It's so mathematically perfect that it almost makes you forget to ask what it was all for. The thousands of French soldiers bleeding out in the freezing snow that day were dying to protect a monarchy. They had traded a Bourbon king for a Bonaparte emperor, and the ultimate reward for their revolutionary zeal was being fed into a meat grinder so their new boss could redesign the map of Europe to his personal liking. Austerlitz was a masterpiece, yes, but it was a masterpiece of ego. 4-6. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt, 1906. Let's talk about the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt in 1906. This isn't just a military engagement. It is a perfect, blood-soaked 19th century case study in toxic workplace dynamics and corporate credit theft. The setup is that Napoleon has decided it's time to dismantle Prussia. At the time, the Prussian military is essentially a legacy brand running entirely on a 50-year-old reputation. They are the blockbuster video of European militaries. They are still using the exact same parade ground tactics from the days of Frederick the Great, and their high command is basically an aristocratic retirement home. Their commander-in-chief, the Duke of Brunswick, is 71 years old. So, the French army moves in. On October 14th, Napoleon finds what he naturally assumes is the main Prussian army at Jena. He spends the entire night doing what he does best. Micromanaging. He's personally directing artillery placements in the dark by torchlight, hyping up his troops, and treating the whole thing like a highly publicized product launch. The next morning, he unleashes 90,000 French soldiers against a Prussian force of roughly 38,000. He essentially brings a sledgehammer to swat a fly. He absolutely crushes them, strikes a heroic pose on the battlefield, and immediately starts drafting the victory press release in his head, completely convinced he has just won the entire war single-handedly. Meanwhile, just 13 miles to the north at a town called Auerstedt, his subordinate, Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, runs into a slight problem. Davout commands the 30 Corps, numbering about 27,000 men. Stepping through the dense morning fog, he literally bumps into the actual main Prussian army, commanded by the King of Prussia himself, with over 60,000 men. To make matters worse, Davout has a colleague nearby, Marshal Bernadotte, commanding another 20,000 French troops. Bernadotte hears the cannons, receives Davout's frantic requests for backup, and essentially leaves him on red. He slowly marches away, achieving the ultimate not my department energy, leaving his co-worker to face certain death. So Davout is completely isolated, outnumbered more than 2-1, fighting the core of the Prussian war machine. But Davout is basically the ultimate senior back-end engineer. He doesn't care about glory or stage presence. He just writes flawless, unbreakable code. His troops are the best drilled in the entire French army. They form infantry squares, systematically repel massive cavalry charges, led by the Prussian royalty, and shoot with such terrifying mechanical discipline that they fatally wound the Prussian commander-in-chief. Davout doesn't just survive, he goes on the offensive and completely routs a force more than twice his size. It is a staggering, mathematically improbable tactical masterpiece. So how does the CEO handle this? Does he hand over the Employee of the Month plaque? Not quite. Napoleon publishes the 5th bulletin of the Grande Armée. The official narrative is a masterclass in PR spin. Napoleon writes a glowing multi-page account of his own epic struggle at Jena, making it sound like a desperate clash of titans. Davout's miraculous campaign-saving victory at Auerstedt. It gets filed under a minor footnote, heavily implying that Davout was just acting as a tactical distraction as part of Napoleon's brilliant, omniscient master plan. Napoleon even initially accused Davout of seeing double when he reported the size of the army he defeated, because the boss simply couldn't process that someone else caught the big fish. It's the classic Silicon Valley startup scenario. The charismatic CEO takes the stage at a TED Talk to claim sole credit for revolutionizing the entire industry, while the lead engineer who actually built the platform, working 80-hour weeks in the basement and fighting off a total server crash with zero support, barely gets his name spelled correctly in the company newsletter. The French Empire wasn't just a military machine, it was a carefully curated lifestyle brand, and there was only room for one face on the logo. 47. The Battle of Friedland, 1807. The Battle of Friedland in June 1807 was the sledgehammer that finally shattered the Russian army. Napoleon trapped the Russian forces under General Bennigsen with their backs against the Aller River. He intentionally waited to launch the decisive assault until the exact anniversary of his victory at Marengo because the man simply never missed a branding opportunity, and then unleashed Marshal Ney to systematically dismantle them. But the military carnage at Friedland isn't actually the most interesting part of the story. The battle just provided the leverage for what came next. The treaties of Tilsit. And if you want to understand the exact moment the French Empire stopped pretending to be a liberating revolutionary project and fully embraced its era of imperial cartel capitalism, you just have to look at how this treaty was signed. Instead of negotiating in a palace or a standard military tent, Napoleon decided the occasion required aggressive theatricality. He ordered his combat engineers to construct an elaborate, custom-built wooden pavilion on a massive raft, moored exactly in the dead center of the Niemen River. This represented the precise geographical boundary between the French and Russian zones of control. It was less a diplomatic summit and more an exclusive, highly militarized pop-up VIP lounge. On June 25th, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I were rowed out to the raft simultaneously. They embraced warmly. Alexander reportedly opened the conversation with, "I hate the English as much as you do," to which Napoleon smoothly replied, "In that case, peace is made." They spent the next several days flattering each other, hosting extravagant dinners and casually carving up the map of Europe like it was a proprietary real estate portfolio. And the absolute best historical detail, the King of Prussia, Frederick William III, whose country was essentially the main item on the menu, wasn't allowed on the raft. He was literally left standing in the mud on the riverbank, occasionally riding his horse up and down in the rain, while two rival emperors inside a floating gazebo negotiated the deletion of half his kingdom. It is perhaps the most humiliating geopolitical cuckolding in modern European history. Inside that pavilion, it was a pure mafia sit-down. Two syndicate bosses dividing the territory. They stripped Prussia of half its land and population. They created the Kingdom of Westphalia completely out of thin air, entirely so Napoleon could give his 22-year-old brother Jerome a cushy executive management job. They established the Duchy of Warsaw, not as a truly independent nation for the Polish people, but as a heavily militarized French buffer state, and they locked in the continental system, an absolute embargo against British trade that effectively held the entire European economy hostage to Bonaparte's personal vendetta. Nobody bothered to ask the millions of Germans, Poles, or Lithuanians actually living on that land what they wanted. The soaring rhetoric of the French Revolution, the rights of man, the destruction of tyranny, had completely vanished. The raft at Tilsit stripped away the ideological branding once and for all. It proved the Napoleonic project was never about liberating the people of Europe from the yoke of feudalism. It was a hostile corporate takeover. It was simply about replacing the old hereditary management with a new, highly aggressive startup board. 8. The Battle of Borodino, 1812. We finally arrive at 1812, the invasion of Russia. To understand Borodino, you have to understand the sheer delusional arrogance of the entire enterprise. Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée, a staggering force of over 600,000 men drawn from across his newly conquered European subsidiaries. It was essentially the largest hostile corporate takeover in military history. He packed for a brisk, 6-week summer campaign, assuming he'd march in, win a decisive battle, and force Tsar Alexander back into his economic embargo against Britain. But the Russian army, commanded by General Kutuzov, refused to play the game. They just kept walking backwards into the massive, terrifying expanse of the Russian interior, burning their own crops, villages and bridges as they went. By the time Kutuzov finally stopped to fight at Borodino on September 7th, just 70 miles west of Moscow, Napoleon had already lost roughly half his army to typhus, dysentery, and desertion without fighting a single major battle. The battle itself was an industrial-scale slaughterhouse. Forget the sweeping, elegant maneuvers of Austerlitz. Borodino was a claustrophobic meat grinder. Over 250,000 men and 1,200 cannons were crammed into a narrow, muddy front. Napoleon, suffering from a severe cold and a sudden lack of imagination, abandoned any complex flanking tactics. He simply ordered massive, relentless frontal assaults against fortified Russian earthworks like the Bagration flèches and the Raevski redoubt. It was a purely mathematical approach to spending human lives. By sunset, over 70,000 men were dead or horribly wounded. The artillery fired so constantly, an estimated 3 shots per second, that the sheer acoustic trauma deafened survivors for days. But technically, the French won. Kutuzov eventually ordered a tactical retreat. The road to Moscow was wide open. Napoleon had achieved his primary KPI. A week later, he marched into the ancient Russian capital expecting the traditional imperial reward sequence. The mayor hands over the keys, the Tsar sends a panicked envoy, and they negotiate a highly publicized peace treaty that looks great in the Paris papers. Instead, he found a ghost town. The Russian governor, Count Rostopchin, hadn't just evacuated the city, he had allegedly released the inmates from the local prisons, ordered them to set the buildings on fire, and methodically removed or destroyed all the fire engines. Napoleon had just paid the highest butcher's bill in European history to conquer a pile of smoking ashes. What followed is the ultimate geopolitical manifestation of the sunk cost fallacy. Napoleon sat in the Kremlin for 35 days, staring at the ruins, waiting for a letter of surrender from the Tsar that was never coming. He was so completely disconnected from reality that he spent part of his time drafting administrative regulations for the Comédie Française theatre back in Paris, desperately pretending everything was under control. When he finally realized the reality of his balance sheet and ordered the retreat in mid-October, it was already too late. The ensuing march back across the devastated winter landscape was an apocalyptic horror show. Men ate their own frozen horses to survive. Thousands were crushed or drowned during the panicked crossing of the freezing Berezina River. Out of the 600,000 men who entered Russia, barely 100,000 limped out. Borodino is the ultimate example of winning the argument, but burning down the house. Napoleon achieved every single one of his tactical objectives and, in doing so, guaranteed the total destruction of his own empire. It's a stark reminder that in geopolitics, a military victory is entirely meaningless if the victor fundamentally misunderstands the reality of the country they are standing in. You can win the battle, take the city, and still lose absolutely everything.